Anybody who's ever met me knows that they'll never hear the end of me talking about Haruhi Suzumiya. Okay, that's a lie. Anybody who's ever been made aware of my existence will never hear the end of my absolute obsession and devotion to Haruhi Suzumiya. Now that's the truth. The series has been with me since I watched the anime at age 12, and it's truly shaped me into who I am today. Everything about it, the characters, the art, the story, everything is so beautiful and flawless. Well, okay, there was one flaw with the anime. It's unfinished. Painfully unfinished. Out of 11 volumes, KyoAni has only adapted the first 4 in their entirety, and parts of the 5th and 6th ones. While Haruhi is unfortunately no longer in its prime, it still has a passionate fanbase who's been rallying hard for a 3rd season, despite Kadokawa and KyoAni not seeming to care. I mean, honestly, can you really blame them though? Would it really make a lot of sense from a financial standpoint? The first season came out in 2006, then the second season that was originally slated for 2007 got delayed to 2009, then there was a movie in 2010, and since then all we've gotten was a spin-off anime in 2015 based on Puyo's spin-off manga, The Disappearance of Yuki Nagato-chan. KyoAni, of course, had nothing to do with it. Instead it was made by Studio Satellite, known for making, other stuff that I'm not familiar with, but I'm guessing some of it might be popular. The novels haven't had a steady pace either. The first 9 were released very consistently from 2003 to 2007. Then after the dissociation of Haruhi Suzumiya ended on a cliffhanger, the 2-volume continuation and conclusion of that arc would finally arrive in 2011. It coincided with an additional chapter, Rainy Day, and then the next chapter, Random Numbers, would be included with the art book Haruhi Hyaka in 2013. Then finally, after a 5-year wait, we get 7 Wonders Over Time in 2018 to celebrate Sneaker's 30th anniversary. A new novel though, still no sign sadly. Even if there were one, I'm sure it would consist of nothing more than those 3 standalone chapters we've already seen. So unfortunately, due to declining relevancy, demand, and consistent continuation of the source material, hopes for a 3rd season seem to get deader in the water as time goes on. But perhaps, instead of a new season to cater to all the fans of the first 2, what if they instead made a brand new anime? One that can satisfy both the old fans who have been dying for more anime content, and new fans who aren't very familiar with the original and want to try it now. It worked for the manga after Makoto Mizuno fucked up his attempt and Gaku Sugano was hired to pick up the slack. Even if that manga was still far from perfect, subject for another time. For the general public, anime, along with many other things, is a very temporary form of entertainment. Whatever's new is going to be the talk of the town for a while until they move on to something else. Most people aren't like me who obsess over dumb bullshit that most people forgot about before I was even born. With that in mind, continuing a show like Haruhi would be very difficult, but starting from scratch could have a much greater effect in appealing to the mass market. Fruits Basket is doing exactly that later this year and it's looking to be awesome when it finally comes out. Other franchises such as Yu-Gi-Oh! And Full Metal Alchemist have also had second animes that attempted to be truer to the creator's vision and the source material they respond from. Of course, that arises the question, how would they handle it? The original anime did a nearly pixel-perfect job of translating the novels into animation, so how could it possibly be redone? It would inevitably result in people comparing the two and potentially even split the fandom between purists who preferred the old and newcomers who prefer the new. Well, I think the most important step in the reboot would be to make it more accessible without losing the magic of the original. For instance, I think they should ditch the wonky chronology of the original. Many purists will insist that you watch in broadcast order, even for your first time, while I argue that while broadcast order served its purpose when it was just Season 1, Season 2 and the movie fix that problem entirely and allow you to enjoy the series in one go with a satisfying ending and no need to sacrifice coherency. I think a good way of catering to the old fans is to write the episodes in a way that everything that Season 1 covered can be rewatched in its old broadcast order equivalent and give the same effect that fans of that viewing order prefer. Someday in the Rain could be omitted if they really need to make space to cover everything the novels did, but if they so choose, keep it in. The other big change that would need to be made is to Endless 8. As much as everyone loves to hate on it, and as infuriating as it is that fucking everyone feels the need to bring it up in every goddamn Haruhi discussion, I will always defend it for being a beautiful way of demonstrating how you can cover the same events in so many different ways, while also adding to the dramatic tone of the arc. It may not have been accurate to the novels, but it's still great for what it is and is one of the many things that makes the anime so unique. Unfortunately though, I think that for accessibility's sake, it should be heavily reduced. Instead of the full 8 episodes, only make it 3 episodes, all with their own different variations on the same events, completely redone from the ground up, the same way KyoAni did. It doesn't need to be as excessive, but it can still hold the same greatness that the original had. The first one is the first repetition of the whole fiasco. Second one is 15,000 repetitions later where they all learn about their situation and Kyon fails to stop it. And then the third episode is the last one where Kyon breaks out of the time loop. Side note, the novel and manga ended on 15,498 repetitions, while the anime ended on 15,532. I want this reboot to end on something even higher than that, like 15,679. It would be a funny little Easter egg, as if to say that it gets worse for our heroes every time this story is retold. Those two aside, there's not a whole lot I'd change about the original, but if we're rebooting it instead of just plain continuing it, changes are not only inevitable, but also required. If they go full Evangelion and do it shot for shot, it'll be seen as lazy, especially since unlike Evangelion, the original's animation doesn't show much age. I guess the most I can ask for is that Nagaru Tanigawa be heavily involved in the show's direction and ensure that everything they do falls in line with his vision. Hell, if he wants, he could even suggest changes from the original that he'd like to see. I think the biggest doozy when it comes to changes is disappearance. Like, how can you possibly tackle this behemoth of a masterpiece of cinema? In this situation, they couldn't just put the series on pause for a movie, let alone release another movie with the exact same title. Not that that never happens. Part of why KyoAni made it into a movie was because they didn't want to be constrained by network and length restrictions. The movie is not paced like an episode of the series, it's much slower and more methodical. It's a very delicate work of art that can't be toyed with, or else it loses some of its spirit. Really? I have no idea how they can do this in a way that'll hold up to the standards set by KyoAni. Maybe one day this reboot will actually miraculously happen and I'll somehow be proven wrong. Fuck if I know, man. All I can say is, keep it in and use up as many episode slots as needed to make it work. Now we get to the spiciest and most exciting part of the video. Adapting everything that the original anime didn't cover. Immediately we have a question mark. Do we cover all the manga's extra chapters? Well, for that we need to ask more questions. Did Nagaru Tanigawa write those chapters? Does he want to keep them in? And do we have enough episodes to include them? For the sake of discussion and simplicity, let's say with Endless 8 reduced to 3 episodes, Someday in the Rain being included, and every other story being the same length it was in the original anime, we have just enough slots to fill all the other novels, but unfortunately, no Rainy Day, Random Numbers, or Seven Wonders Over Time, as those have yet to be included in an actual novel. That and also Seven Wonders' chronological placement, which would add some issues. Maybe it could be a separate OVA, I'm not sure. The first 2 chapters after Disappearance are kinda weird with their chronology. Snowy Mountain Syndrome begins with the SOS Brigade stuck in their situation of the chapter, then cuts to a flashback of them planning their vacation, then Love at First Sight takes place, and then we get to see the rest of Snowy Mountain Syndrome. The manga simplifies this by just having Love at First Sight happen before anything of Snowy Mountain, but I think being truer to the novels would be ideal in this case. Have one episode that encompasses the beginning of Snowy Mountain Syndrome where they plan the vacation, leaving the foreshadowing flashback out of it, along with the entirety of Love at First Sight. Despite the manga making it 3 chapters instead of the usual 2 for each standard length novel chapter, it's a relatively small story in the timeline and can be condensed to a single episode along with Snowy Mountain's prologue. The rest of Snowy Mountain Syndrome, however, is quite lengthy, as in it literally takes up half the book it's in. Even with its beginning chopped off and placed into another episode, this one's gonna have to be a 2-parter. After that, we get the very playful Where Did the Cat Go? Very chill, comedic chapter that can easily be made into a single episode. Without going into spoiler territory, the prologue of the intrigues of Haruhi Suzumiya is another reason why we can't skimp on Disappearance in order to avoid inconsistencies. Despite how important this chapter is, I think it's brief enough to get away with being only 1 episode. Kyon, Nagato, and Mikuru do their thing, and then Kyon chats it up with Koizumi afterwards. Simple yet integral stuff. The Melancholy of Mikuru Asahina is a truly beautiful chapter. It does what the original anime sadly couldn't do and utilize Mikuru out in the field while also giving her some great personal development. Once again, it's brief enough to be a single episode, and one touching episode it would be. The Intrigues of Haruhi Suzumiya has a very honest title, as it's a very intriguing story. This is the first long story after Disappearance, and it ended up being the longest single volume in the series. Unlike the average Haruhi novel that's only 200 pages, Intrigues is 277, with the prologue that takes place a while earlier and is treated separately is only 36. This is gonna be another 6-parter, possibly even 7, but some of the crazy shit that goes down in this novel, I would so look forward to see animated. Remember what I said about Snowy Mountain Syndrome? How it literally takes up half the book? Well, The Indignation of Haruhi Suzumiya has 2 chapters. Each one, of course, takes up half the book. And yes, the book is normal length. Yeah, both of these will need to be 2-parters. I think Editor-in-Chief having all these interesting stories written by the characters will be the most interesting part, even if they need to be split between 2 different episodes. Now it's time to make way for the biggest and most eventful development in the entire Haruhi intellectual property. The 3-volume arc of the Dissociation of Haruhi Suzumiya and the 2 parts of the Surprise of Haruhi Suzumiya. Now I want to remain as spoiler-free as possible with this video, but it's kind of hard to describe the significance of this particular arc without minor spoilers at the very least, so here's the time code to skip all that. Don't say I didn't warn you. This arc spans 2 parallel timelines that converge and combine near the end. The story switches between the 2 timelines at regular intervals. Until right before the point where they converge, the novels switch on a day-by-day basis, while the manga only switches at significant points in the timeline's story. I think switching mid-episode would be pretty awkward, so I say switch between each episode. The first episode covers everything before the split. Second episode takes place on timeline A, third episode is timeline B, fourth episode goes back to A, and so on. The arc would end with 1 episode on each timeline telling the events prior to the convergence. Then another episode showing the timelines coming together and everything after. It's not a perfect plan and it might be a bit excessive, but I think this is the best way to maintain the pacing of the novels while keeping things easy to follow for the audience. Though it's not the only option I had in mind. One other, much more ambitious idea for this mega arc would be to adapt it in the form of 2 movies. Let's say the series up until that point begins in 2020 and ends in 2021. The first movie, titled The Dissociation of Haruhi Suzumiya, can come out in 2022. This movie will be about the length of Disappearance and cover everything of Timeline A from the very beginning, even before the point of the timeline splitting. Then the movie ends on a cliffhanger right before the timelines converge. 2023 would be when the next movie, titled The Surprise of Haruhi Suzumiya, releases just in time for the 20th anniversary of the first novel, and is once again disappearance length. It begins right when the timeline splits into Timeline B, and then continues on to show how the timelines come back together and everything after. The main reason I suggest this is because 1, after Disappearance, Dissociation and Surprise is the most climactic arc in the series, and 2, if this reboot isn't going to have its own movie for Disappearance, it would be fun to see Disappearance get 1-ups to compensate. The biggest downside I see is that it would make things a lot harder to follow, especially since there's going to be a year-long wait between the 2 movies. Not as bad as the 4-year wait between the Dissociation and Surprise novels, but still. This is a huge risk and kind of a crazy idea, but that's just how Haruhi would want it. I spent the bulk of this video discussing how the story would be handled, but there's one very important question that I've neglected this entire time. Who would even make this? KyoAni unfortunately seems out of the question, but if there's any other studio that had the balls to take up this offer, who should it be? There are far too many candidates for me to even be familiar with, so I'm gonna give my own half-assed uninformed idea. Studio White Fox. Truth be told, I haven't actually seen anything they've made other than the most popular and obvious anime of theirs, Steins Gate. I may not have the chance to say this in a future video, so I'll say it here. Steins Gate is the only thing I can think of that's really comparable to Haruhi. The character dynamics, the story, the pacing, the sci-fi aspect, and of course the animes being unusually excellent adaptations of their respective source material. It's all similar in a way. They may not have the same raw animation talent as KyoAni, but I'm sure they'd still have what it takes to knock it out of the park. It may be odd and kind of pointless to make a video this long discussing an anime adaptation that doesn't exist and probably never will. I just take a lot of enjoyment in theorizing about what I want to happen in a semi-realistic way. It's fun, and if life ain't fun, that's when it's time to spread excitement all over the world. Because as we all know, that's what Haruhi wishes for.